Do you know what items you should never store in your prepper pantry? As we delve into the world of preparedness, it's crucial to understand that the contents of your prepper pantry can make or break your survival strategy. In times of a food crisis or shortages, a well-stocked pantry can be your lifeline, your fortress against the storm of uncertainty that rages around you. But not all supplies are created equal, and sometimes the items you thought were essential could turn out to be your biggest downfall. It's not just about packing your pantry to the brim, it's about stocking it with the right kind of supplies, ones that will not only last but also provide you with the nutrients you need to stay strong and healthy. So let's cut to the chase. What are the items that should never find a home in your prepper pantry? Surviving a crisis is all about being prepared, but not all supplies are created equal. Let's dive into the 12 items you should never store in your prepper pantry. First off, let's talk about perishable foods. Now, it might seem obvious, but you'd be surprised how often this mistake is made. Foods like fresh fruits, vegetables, and dairy products have a short shelf life. They're great for your everyday diet, but in a food crisis situation, they're not going to last. So as tempting as it might be to stock up on fresh produce, you need to think about foods that have a longer shelf life. Moving on, let's discuss canned goods past their expiration date. While it's true that many canned goods can last beyond their best before date, it's not a risk you should be willing to take. The health risks associated with consuming expired canned goods, like botulism, are simply too great. When it comes to your prepper pantry, better safe than sorry is definitely a rule to live by. Next, we have items in damaged packaging. This one's a big no-no. Damaged packaging can lead to food spoilage and contamination. In a survival situation, the last thing you need is food poisoning. So if you see a dent, a tear, or any sign of damage, it's best to leave that item on the shelf. And finally, foods that require a lot of water to prepare. In a crisis, water may be scarce and you don't want to waste it on cooking. Foods like rice, pasta, and dehydrated meals may seem like a good idea, but they can consume a lot of your water supply. Instead, look for foods that require minimal water to prepare or can be eaten as is. Remember, the goal is long-term survival, not short-term convenience. Now, let's move on to the next 4 items. Moving on, let's tackle some items that might seem like good ideas but could actually do more harm than good. First up, foods you don't like. It might seem counterintuitive, but hear me out. In a survival situation, you want every calorie to count. You want food that will not only sustain you but also boost your morale. If you're forcing down canned beets and you hate beets, that's going to be a long, miserable meal. On top of that, food you don't enjoy is likely to sit unused, taking up valuable storage space. Next, let's discuss foods you're allergic to. This might seem obvious, but in a crisis, it's easy to forget about dietary restrictions. If someone in your group has a peanut allergy, for instance, you want to avoid storing anything with peanuts. Remember, in a survival situation, medical assistance might not be readily available. Third on our list, foods that cause excessive thirst. When resources are limited, you want to avoid anything that could deplete your water supply faster. Foods high in sodium like canned soups or processed meats can make you thirsty and deplete your water resources quickly. Finally, we come to alcohol. Now, I know what you're thinking. A little tipple to take the edge off could be just the ticket in a crisis, right? Well, not exactly. Alcohol can dehydrate you, impair your judgment, and it's not a great source of nutrition. Sure, a small amount for medicinal or trade purposes could be useful, but don't make it a mainstay of your pantry. Each of these items, while they might seem like good ideas at first glance, could actually be detrimental in a crisis. The key to a successful prepper pantry is careful planning and consideration. Consider the nutritional value, personal preferences, and potential health risks of every item you store. Never underestimate the importance of comfort and safety when it comes to survival. Finally, let's discuss a few items that are often overlooked but could spell disaster in a crisis. Firstly, we have foods that attract pests. While it's true that many items in a pantry could potentially attract pests, certain foods are more likely to do so. Items like grains, cereals, and flours can draw in unwanted guests like weevils or mice if not stored properly. While it's possible to store these items in airtight containers, it's best to avoid them if possible. After all, the last thing you want during a food crisis is a pantry full of pests. Next, we have foods that require refrigeration after opening. Cans of fruit or jars of pickles might seem like a good idea, but once opened, they need to be refrigerated. If the power is out and your fridge isn't working, these items can quickly become a health hazard. So, it's best to steer clear of anything that needs refrigeration after opening. Focus on items that have a longer shelf life and can be consumed in one go, like canned meats or vegetables. Thirdly, we have foods with strong smells. While a fragrant curry or a hearty stew might be appealing under normal circumstances, strong-smelling foods can attract unwanted attention in a crisis. Not just from pests, but from other people too. It's always best to consider discretion when stocking your pantry. Opt for foods that are nutritious and filling, but don't give off a strong aroma. Lastly, we have foods that require special cooking equipment. If you're planning on storing items like dried beans or whole grains, remember that they require a lot of time and energy to cook. In a crisis, you might not have access to your normal cooking methods. It's important to consider the practicality of your pantry items. Always remember, the best prepper pantry is one that's tailored to your needs and abilities. You want to ensure that you're prepared for a food crisis, but also that you're able to make the most of your supplies when the time comes. It's not just about having food, but having food that you can actually use. Now that we've covered the 12 items you should never store in your prepper pantry, let's do a quick recap. Firstly, we discussed canned goods with high acidity. These items, such as canned tomatoes or pineapples, can corrode the can over time, leading to potential contamination. The second item on our list was bulk-sized containers of condiments. While you might be tempted to save by buying in bulk, the fact is, once opened, these items can spoil before you get through them. Next, we touched on perishable goods. Fresh fruits, vegetables, and dairy products might be tempting to stockpile, but their short shelf life makes them a risky choice for long-term storage. Fourth, we warned against storing foods you or your family don't enjoy eating. In a crisis, morale is essential, and forcing down unappetizing meals won't do anyone any favors. Moving on to the middle 4 items, we discussed the pitfalls of storing foods that require a great deal of water to prepare. In a situation where water is scarce, these foods become almost useless. Similarly, we warned against foods that require a lot of cooking time. In a crisis, you want to conserve fuel as much as possible, and these foods just aren't practical. The 7th item was foods with a lot of packaging. The more packaging a food has, the less actual food you're getting for your storage space. And 8th, we advised against storing foods that you're unfamiliar with. Now is not the time to be experimenting with new foods or cooking methods. Our final 4 items started with foods that are high in salt. While these foods might have a long shelf life, they can lead to dehydration, which is the last thing you want in a crisis. Next, we warned against storing foods with short shelf lives. Even non-perishable items can go bad, and you don't want to risk food poisoning when medical help may not be available. 11th, we cautioned against storing foods that produce strong smells. These odors can attract unwanted attention from insects or animals. And finally, we suggested avoiding foods that are difficult to open without the right tools. In a crisis, you don't want to be struggling to open a can of beans when you're hungry and stressed. Being a budget prepper means making smart choices when it comes to what you store in your pantry. It's not just about buying the cheapest items or the ones with the longest shelf life. It's about balancing nutrition, taste, shelf life, and practicality. It's about understanding what you and your family will need in a crisis and planning accordingly. In the end, the key to survival is preparation. Choose wisely, stay prepared, and you'll be ready for whatever comes your way.